All right, well, welcome back. If you don't know me, my name is Jackson. I love talking music, especially with you guys, of course. And every single week, I like to look back at the prior week and sort of review and discuss all of the new albums that I listened to. So, of course, that just includes the 2026 releases as I'm looking for the best albums of the year and whatnot. And so we're doing that today. I listened to 7 more new albums last week. At this point, I'm well over 200 on the year. But let's talk about them. Let's jump right into them. The first album that I listened to last week was You're Gonna Need a Little Music by Yard Act. I had never heard of Yard Act before. I didn't know what I was getting into. And unexpectedly here, I ended up with a pretty solid opinion of this album. It was a pretty solid listen. Now, I only say that it was unexpected because the opening track really threw me for a loop in a really not so good kind of way. It was kind of grating, but thankfully, it wasn't really representative of what was to come on the rest of the album. And what was to come? Well, some pure, fantastic, modern indie punk. It was really, really nice. It checked a lot of boxes of mine, especially when it comes to the genre, and I really felt it was really, really enjoyable when it leaned into a sort of classic punk kind of feel. That feeling is really on full blast in the middle of the album, where I think the band really hit their stride on this record. It was that stretch from Fiction to Janie Said, and I really think that stretch is some of the best punk that I have heard in a while, and I really don't say that lightly. The other tracks on the album, again, aside from the opener, were really solid, and while I don't think they were quite as enjoyable, they didn't feel quite as classic or check quite as many boxes for me, they were still really solid. They were still enjoyable enough that I wanted to keep listening. Again, aside from that opener, I think that opening track was really, thankfully, not a sign of things to come. It's really kind of an outlier as far as the album goes. It's kind of weird. But regardless, this album, it's not anything groundbreaking, but it also didn't really need to be. It stayed in its lane. It didn't try to do anything it didn't need to. And I don't really have many notes. So I could really see this album growing on me as I listen to it even more. And I could see it growing on me in a big way. But for now, my score is a 7.3. 7.3 for Yard Act. I'm going to have to check out more of their albums and music because this was, again, it was really surprising for me. The next album that I listened to last week was Can We Hang Out Sometime by Good Kid. So I finally got around to listening to Good Kid's debut. It was released a few months back, and honestly, having listened to some of their music in the past, I didn't realize that this was their debut. With that said, it was kind of tough for me to get into it, and that's unfortunate. I've enjoyed some of their music in the past, but the sort of blend of early 2000s pop sounds with like 21 Pilots style alt rock and maybe a little bit of punk here and there just wasn't anything that I was into. And I don't think it was anything particularly groundbreaking or innovative. And while not every record has to be groundbreaking, they were just recycling the same sounds that I've heard in alt music for really over a decade at this point. And those sounds, if I'm being totally honest, have rarely done it for me. I've rarely enjoyed those sounds, even back when they were fresh and new and exciting to a lot of people. I just have never really enjoyed them. And that's the unfortunate part about music, right? Is a lot of it is subjective. We can talk objectively about how good a certain aspect is. Wow, this was technically very well done. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is going to be subjective, and I'm okay with that on this channel. This is all my opinion, of course. I'm open to yours. But unfortunately, the sound of this album just doesn't work for me personally. It got old pretty quick, and that's not good considering the album was 25 minutes long. Now, with that said, as I was getting at earlier, it's hard to say that this album was poorly made. In fact, I do think objectively there is a sort of quality to the music here. But on the other hand, the lyrics don't do the album any favors either. There was some really poor lyricism throughout the record, and it just continually took me out of the music, which even if I didn't enjoy it, like I said, I can say it was objectively pretty well done. the lyrics were hurting it, man. And I think that's a real shame. So altogether, I do think this band has talent. I do think they could make really solid music, and I think they have made really solid music in the past with some of their songs and singles that I've listened to. I've enjoyed them. But this album just didn't work for me, didn't do anything for me, and again, those lyrics hurt the score here too. The music, objectively solid, just not for me. So the score here is a 4.1. Not quite what I wanted to give Good Kid in their debut, but that's where we land. I do think it's worth listening to, especially if you're into those sounds that I mentioned earlier. It's just not one that's for me, and so that's why it gets that score. But if you're into it, if you love it, more power to you. I'm glad you do. Something for everybody, right? And I think this could easily be for some people. The next album I listened to was Swallowtail by She's Green. This was a fairly short but a really solid listen. I really enjoyed the sound and atmosphere that kind of was strung throughout the whole record. And it got a little repetitive at times. However, I think the band here managed to do enough within that sound and atmosphere to keep it mostly interesting. There were very few moments that I found myself kind of bored or uninterested. Very, very few. And that's impressive given the similar sound quality throughout the record. Now, there were songs that were just purely shoegaze and very ethereal shoegaze at that. And then there were others that kept that ethereal atmosphere but incorporated sounds of like heavy rock or indie rock, and that was pretty neat. It was a little refreshing given how often people stay in that lane when they do an album like this, especially those more ethereal, atmospheric albums. It was neat to hear other sounds thrown in, and while it didn't deviate much from those two categories, it really didn't need to, especially given the scope and the length of the album. I think altogether it was made really well. I really enjoyed it practically from start to finish, and I just wish there had been more of those different things incorporated because it was super neat. But again, super enjoyable, especially if you're into that sort of atmospheric kind of vibe. If you're looking for something like that, this is a must listen for you on the year. I'm giving this one a 7.0 out of 10. Really solid. Really, really solid. Next up was the latest release from Tyla, and that is A-Pop. Let's talk A-Pop. So as far as the sound of this album goes, I think what we have here are really, really generic and repetitive lyrics over some extremely lackluster and uninteresting beats. And that is certainly a choice. And it's a choice that does not even come close to paying off in any sort of meaningful or enjoyable way. It just doesn't work here. I'm not sure what she was thinking here, but seriously, I don't think I've ever heard such boring beats. It's kind of impressive, honestly. It was so boring. They were so empty sounding. And on that note, to make matters worse on this, those beats and vocals were backed by, for the most part, totally empty production. There are very few exceptions to the things I'm saying. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, boring beats, empty production, generic lyrics. And the only saving grace here is the vocals. And they're solid, they're strong vocals, that's expected, but not so much that they can even come close to saving this album as a whole. Even then, like I've already mentioned a couple times, the lyrics just bring those vocals right back down. They're painfully generic, and it only adds to that feel, that generic feel that just permeates this album. This is definitely among my most boring listens of the year, and when we're looking at what this album was meant to be, that only hurts its case even more. This was totally ineffective, completely boring, and just not at all what I wanted or expected. So this album gets a 2.8 out of 10. I've seen some people who are somewhat enjoying this. Maybe I need to give it a few more re-listens, but man, this was rough for me. This was a rough one. Next up was Little Miss Twain by Shania Twain. And speaking of rough listens, this was a rough listen. it was really rough, man. I mean, every last aspect of this album was so tough to listen to. For starters, the vocals were not up to par, and even for a 60-year-old, I mean, we've had albums drop this year from artists who are multiple decades older than Twain is here, and some that are even close to her age. And if you compare any of the vocals on those records to the vocals on this one, it's night and day. And I'm not sure if that's an issue on her end, if she's just washing up vocally, or if it's an issue on the end of production and some of the choices that they made there were poor. But either way, it made this album so hard to listen to. So hard to listen to. I mean, compare this to Madonna, who is even older than Twain, I think by 7 years now. And it's, again, night and day. It's so weird. And maybe it's the fact that she's trying to sing country. Maybe it's the genres issue. But I just can't really see that holding up. You know what I mean? It just doesn't work for me. So I'm not sure what the issue is here, but it made it tough. And speaking of production, the production and instrumentation on this album was so generic and boring that it made me want to skip legitimately almost every single song. I didn't, but it made me want to. And at the end of the day, this is an album that is everything that people who hate country say that country is. And even with Twain trying different styles of country, she couldn't break out of this horribly basic, generic feel. Now, within those multiple styles, she tried out modern country conventions, which didn't work, classic country conventions, which felt kind of soulless, even rock and roll conventions, which just felt really generic, and even on one track, a sort of tropical sort of country style, and it really didn't work. None of it worked for me, though. Absolutely none of it. At times, the album literally felt like satire, with super basic country songs about broken hearts and staying away from her truck, but it wasn't satire, it was real, and that only makes matters worse here. I was looking on every track for something to redeem it, but absolutely nothing came of that. Vocals, lyrics, which I didn't even get into, they were bad. Instrumentation, production, none of it was close to par. At best, there were a few solid, isolated moments or aspects of songs. For example, the backing vocals on New Love. But that's about it. And those moments were really few and far between. So unfortunately, I have to say it might be time for Twain to hang it up. She might be a little washed here as far as making new music goes. She might just need to stick to touring and performing the stuff that got her popular in the first place, because this just isn't it. So my score here is going to be a 0.8 out of 10. Maybe I just didn't get this one, but it was so hard for me to listen to, and that is a new channel low. It's unfortunate here. But speaking of records, let's break another one with my next listen, which is Mount Zero by Swapmeet. And if I'm being honest, I do not think that my words can do this album justice. Nor do I think I can put into words just how hard-rocking this album is. And that is only one of many reasons that I'm loving this record as much as I am right now. Not only does it have this insanely awesome hard-rocking element, but there is a awesome and undeniable technical skill that is happening with the guitar that's under this layer of perfectly intense sound. I mean, if you really listen, it is unbelievably impressive. I was impressed with every aspect of the guitar on this album. The tone was great. The way it blended with other sounds was perfect. But also, the vocals here were an absolute standout to me. I think both vocalists did a fantastic job matching the style and atmosphere of this album, again, in a literally perfect way. I also think that the two vocalists helped change up the sound of the album in a way that really kept it from getting stale. But for me, it was far from stale. That only helped their case even more. Now, I say all this, and even still, the sound was somewhat repetitive, but the band here played in so many different aspects of that sound that it did not matter at all. What's even more impressive is that within all that hard rocking shoegaze and alt rock, there was an emotional side of things towards the end that was really unexpected and honestly about as close to perfect as you'll get. Truly, I do not know what's not to love here, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. I don't know if I've said it on this channel actually, but I've said it before, I'll say it again. I am loving this 90s alt rock renaissance that's happening in indie music right now. And among the many albums that are taking part in that 90s alt renaissance, this might be the best, or at the very least my favorite one to come out of that trend. It is fantastic. I have not stopped listening to it since I first listened last week. I am unbelievably impressed. It knocked my shoes off. I'm giving this album a new channel record high of 9.5. So this is the highest score I've given out on this channel so far. Now, you've probably seen my 10s. If you haven't, they're in the first video in this series. I do have some 10s, but anything in the 9s is hard to come by for me. Not harder than 10s, but it's harder to come by. 9.5 is awesome. It's also my highest score on the year so far. So do with that what you will. We got one more here, wrapping things up with Petal by Ariana Grande. Now, I am coming into this album as somebody who just historically has really not enjoyed Ariana Grande's music. But with that, I'm actually pretty surprised with what was produced here. Much of the album really surprised me in enjoyable ways, but in the same breath, there were a lot of choices that I really didn't like. But at the same time, they're choices that I expected. They're choices that, from what I've listened to her, which is a lot of her music, I have come to expect. It's almost like she couldn't help herself. It's almost like she couldn't help but throw in those sort of aspects. But we'll get into that. Let's talk bad first. So first and foremost, I can't help but feel like she was trying to reheat some of her old hits throughout the album here. There's a few tracks that just feel like some of her older songs. Like you legitimately could have convinced me that they were demos or early versions of some of her more popular tracks. And that's not the norm for the record. However, I definitely did not enjoy it. I did not enjoy that feeling. Secondly, the songs that incorporated hip-hop beats and hip-hop elements just didn't work for me. And that's sort of what I was referring to earlier, in that these are the choices that she tends to make on most of her albums, those sort of hip-hop beats and elements, and I just didn't vibe with it here. I rarely do with her. It rarely works for me. It really didn't work for me here. They just felt really underdeveloped, maybe more so than usual for her. And lastly, another thing that I just haven't really vibed with as far as Ariana's music goes, I just really don't enjoy the lyrics and songs where she's kind of being snarky and attempting to be clever. It just has never really worked for me, especially with her. It doesn't work here. If you've listened to the album, you know what I'm talking about. And maybe it works for you. Awesome if it does. Doesn't for me. I don't enjoy that. But let's talk positives now. First off, the sound on the songs that weren't really overtaken by like hip-hop conventions were really, really enjoyable. There were electronic elements and a really nice production on these tracks that ranged from somewhat average but enjoyable to really solid and surprisingly so. Many of these songs felt noticeably inspired, and I just wish that the majority of the album, if not all of it, had stayed in that lane. In a lot of ways, it felt inspired by folks like Carly Rae Jepsen, especially in the production of those non-hip-hop inspired tracks, and that's in an entirely good way. I was largely impressed. I also think it's worth noting that Freak might be my favorite song from her ever. That track really blew me away. I was totally caught off guard by it in a really, really great way. So altogether, it's far from my favorite pop album of the year, but it was surprising, and I can totally understand why people are loving it as much as they are. So my score here is going to be a 6.7. It's definitely going to be among my favorite from the artist, which again, not a big fan of her, but I'm glad I gave this one a shot. There was some good that came out of it. All right, well, that wraps up my listening for last week. I would love to know what you guys thought of these albums. Let me know in the comments. I would also love if you have any recommendations of albums you want me to listen to or review. I would love to listen to your recommendations, so drop them in the comments. I will get to them soon. I don't really get many recommendations, so if you drop them, I will definitely hit them pretty soon. If you want to know what I am listening to right now that aren't these albums, check out the playlists linked below. And if you want to check me out on other socials, also check out the links below. I'd love to interact with you on Instagram, TikTok, places like that. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss a single one of these videos, and stick around. I will see you next time.